So we're going to keep going with chapter 1. This is the last part of 1.1, then we'll move on to 1.2. So we understand the scientific method, right? We understand how results, how an experiment is done and how results are gathered. Now, how are results reported? So scientists, of course, have to report their work, right? They have to share their findings with the scientific community and also with the lay community, right? And so, trying to move this over just a little bit. So what they're going to do is they're going to publish their results in what we call peer-reviewed journals, okay? And this peer review process is so important to scientific work. Let me just explain to you a little bit about the peer review process. So if you've ever read a scientific journal, there are many of them. So for example, the journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, or there's a scientific journal called Science. So any of these peer-reviewed journals, what that means is that the scientists who publish their work in those journals, they've gone through kind of a rigorous check on their scientific work. And so the scientist, his or her lab conducts the research. They write up a scientific paper showing, all the steps in that paper, which we're going to go over in just a second, showing essentially exactly how they did their work and then what they got for results. Now, they'll submit that to a scientific journal, and that scientific journal will review their findings, and they will also kind of send out that work to top scientists in that field. Okay, and those top scientists will be the reviewers. They're going to read through the paper. Maybe they will even try out some of the scientific experiments that were conducted to see if they get the same results. And they really kind of do a check on the work that's being submitted, which is really, really, again, important because, scientific studies matter. The results of those studies matter. Okay, they definitely, can impact all of us. So the process is very, very rigorous. So there's going to be, top experts in that field that will review those scientific manuscripts to make sure that the work is reliable. Okay, and then it will be, published. Usually the reviewers will send back comments to the writers, the authors of the manuscript, and so the authors may have to, repeat an experiment again, or maybe put in another experiment that's kind of missing to fill in a gap, or change it in some way. Maybe the results, how they've written their conclusions of the results, maybe the reviewers don't agree that the data shows that, and so usually there's some tweaking and some back and forth before that article actually gets published in that scientific peer-reviewed journal. Okay, so when you're reading about scientific studies, it's good to get your information from primary literature, from these peer-reviewed journals, because it kind of takes the bias out of things. If you're reading from popular press, if you're reading, conclusions of something, in the Observer Dispatch, or if you're watching National Geographic, or you're watching the news, right? That's not primary literature. So you always want to go back to the primary literature to see what was actually done with the study. When you look at popular press, the news or National Geographic or the Discovery Channel, sure, they draw their conclusion hopefully based on scientific articles, but it's important to go back to the source because there can be bias put into conclusions that really aren't true. Okay, so always get your scientific information from peer-reviewed journals. Okay, so parts and pieces of a scientific manuscript or a scientific paper or a scientific article. Okay, we kind of use all those terms interchangeably. The scientist will have to start off kind of the front cover of your scientific paper or manuscript as you submit it to that journal. You're going to start with an abstract. And so an abstract is usually a couple paragraphs long, no more than a page. And what that is it's a summary of the work within that manuscript. Okay, that's kind of the cover page of the manuscript. You're going to be writing some lab reports this semester. And your lab reports are going to kind of look like a scientific manuscript, except for we do leave off the abstract. You won't be responsible to write an abstract. After the abstract page in, you will be writing this. It's called the introduction. So in the introduction section, the scientific authors are going to provide the background. Okay, so this usually requires going to other manuscripts. So looking in scientific journals and finding the work of other scientists to help to give you a background section. And then you always want to end with your rationale, the purpose of why you're doing this scientific research, and then what was your hypothesis before you carried out this work. Because the background section is going to require you to go to all other sources, you are going to have to include citations in this section. Okay, so again, scientists will draw upon work of other scientists, and they will, of course, cite and give those scientists credit. Okay, when you go to do your lab reports this semester, you're going to use sources like your OpenStax textbook, as well as your laboratory book, and you'll have to cite those. You're allowed to go to other sources as well. However, if you do, they should be peer-reviewed sources. Okay? Okay, so you got your abstract, your introduction. That's going to be followed by your materials and methods section. In this section, scientists will put forth all of the materials that they used in their scientific studies, and then they will talk about how the experiments were actually conducted. And depending on the journal that the manuscript is being submitted to, sometimes these are extremely detailed and sometimes they're not so detailed. However, scientists are usually asked to be thorough enough to allow the scientific reviewer to repeat the experiment if they choose to. Okay? In your lab reports, we're going to ask you to write out every single step. So everything you used and then every step. And in the methods section for lab, we allow you to list the steps. You don't have to write it in paragraph form. Okay. Okay, so you've got your abstract, your introduction, your materials and methods, and that's going to be followed by your results section. So in the results section, this is where you put your findings. So your numbers or your pictures. You would include any tables, graphs of your data. Okay, those would go there. In the next section, the discussion or conclusion section, you can kind of put those together. This is where you would interpret and discuss your results. Okay, so what do those results mean? You would also accept or reject your hypothesis here in the discussion section. You would talk about future experiments here in the discussion section. And then lastly, you would have a references or a bibliography page where you would put all those sources that you used. Okay, so that would be called a primary manuscript going into the primary literature. There are also other types of scientific papers. So for example, there is something called the review article. Okay, in a review article, this isn't a primary study. There wasn't an experiment that was conducted by the scientist. Instead, a scientist who's writing a review article is going to be recording a summary of the data that is out there. So they're going to be looking at a bunch of different primary articles and kind of putting them together. So a summary of the data and then a commentary of what that data means. Okay, so there's primary scientific articles and then there's review articles. Okay, primary scientific articles, experiments are actually conducted and results are discussed. In a review article, instead, it's a summary of all the data that's out there and a commentary on that data. Okay, so take a break here, and you're going to go through and you're going to answer these questions on your in-class assessment. Okay, so you want to go through each one of these and make sure you answer them. When you're finished, you're going to go on to the next slide. So go ahead and press pause and then press play when you're done. Okay, so you've finished those questions. Let me just give you a couple questions to make sure that we're on the same page. So the first one, the part of the scientific manuscript where the author interprets results and draws conclusions, is that called the introduction, the materials and methods, the discussion section, or the references? I'll give you a second. Hopefully you answered the discussion. Next one. The process of blank helps to ensure that a scientist's research is original, significant, logical, and thorough. Is that process called publication, public speaking, peer review, or the scientific method? And that process is called peer review. Okay, so we're on to the next section of Chapter 1. So Chapter 1.2, Themes and Concepts in Biology. And so here's our learning outcomes for this section. So you should be able to identify and describe the shared properties of life. So we're going to go over a list of properties that all living things share. You should be able to describe the levels of biological organization. It's going to be a hierarchy that we'll talk about. You should gain an understanding of the diversity of life, and you should be able to list some of the branches of biological study. So that's where we're going. Okay, so to start off, here's our list of the shared properties of life. So all living things share these. We're going to go over each one individually and make sure that you understand what each of them means. So all living things display order, respond to environmental stimuli, are capable of reproduction, growth, and development. They all display regulation and homeostasis. They all do metabolism, energy processing. All are capable of evolution, and adaptation is a key feature of all living things. So let's start with display order. Ooh, let me move this so you can see that nice big fat toad. This picture is right from your textbook. All living things, from the simplest single-celled organisms to the most complex multicellular organisms like this frog or us, all organisms display organization, and they have coordinated structures consisting of one or more cells. Okay. Before I go on, I just want to reiterate and make sure that you understand the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and unicellular versus multicellular. And when we get into Chapter 4 and we start to talk about cells in depth, we'll come back to these terms. So prokaryotic organisms are always unicellular. Okay, they're always composed of just one cell. And prokaryotic organisms lack a nucleus. So they have genetic information, but it's not found in a compartment. Okay? The other form of living things on the planet, we can really break them up into prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Eukaryotic organisms are sometimes unicellular, and sometimes they're multicellular. Okay? Most are multicellular, but there are some that are unicellular. Again, that term eukaryotic means having a membrane-bound nucleus. So they have genetic material, and it's found in a membrane-bound compartment. Now, whether we're looking at prokaryotic unicellular organisms or eukaryotic organisms, we find order and organization. Okay, even in a very simple prokaryote that doesn't have a nucleus, well, their DNA is still in a very distinct region. And they still have processes that are occurring on the plasma membrane. And they still have ribosomes that are in specific locations making proteins. So there's definitely order and organization, even to those very simple single-celled organisms. It kind of becomes more evident when you look at multicellular organisms, like this toad pictured here. This guy has not just many cells, but those cells are going to be coordinated into tissues, and those tissues are coordinated into organs and organ systems. So those cells within those tissues, they communicate with each other. They're organized, they're structured. Very, very, very evident, especially when you're looking at these multicellular organisms. So all living things display order. Okay? All living things respond to stimuli. Okay, so environmental stimuli. If you look here with me first at this picture, okay, down here at the bottom, each one of these red rod-shaped structures is a bacterium. And the little blue structures coming off, they are flagella, whip-like tails. These particular single-celled prokaryotic organisms here, these bacteria, they respond to environmental stimuli. So, for example, if they're looking, for food, they may detect chemicals in the environment, and that whip-like tail can push or pull the organism in the direction of that food. Or if they detect, toxins, those flagella would push the organism away from those toxins. So even the simplest organisms do respond to environmental stimuli. Here, in this picture, we've got some land plants in this picture. Looks like some fern and some other ones. These land plants also respond to stimuli. So they will orient, for example, their leaves towards the sun. It's really neat to watch, for example, sunflowers do this, and you can find videos on YouTube. If you type in, sunflower response to sunlight, you can actually see the sunflowers, the flower part of it, turn, and it's usually time-lapse. You can actually see it turn throughout the day to follow the sun. It's pretty neat. You can see their leaves turn as well. So yeah, plants will definitely respond to environmental stimuli like the sun. They'll orient their leaves towards the sunlight. Why do they do that? Well, the leaves of these land plants are responsible for gathering sunlight to be used in photosynthesis. So yeah, the leaves want to be facing the sun at all times so that they can gather the maximum amount of sunlight to make food, to make energy, okay, or to transform energy, I should say. How about here in this picture? This is a pretty neat example. This is a Venus flytrap, and the Venus flytrap gets some of its nutrition literally from eating other organisms. They do some photosynthesis. However, there are nutrients that they need to get from other organisms. So how does this guy operate? If you look on the left image, what has happened is a poor fly has landed on the Venus flytrap. And so there's going to be structures on that Venus flytrap that are going to sense and detect pressure when that fly lands. And that pressure is going to stimulate a response. What is that response? The closure of those structures. And you can see the poor fly on the right has been closed up with it. What happens next? Well, now the area where that fly is, those cells on the surface are going to start to secrete digestive enzymes. And so those digestive enzymes are released onto that fly, and the fly is literally turned into soup. It's just really broken down, and that soup, that nutrient-rich soup, will then be absorbed by that plant. Okay? Yeah, so all living things, whether it's a plant, an animal, a very simple single-celled organism, all living things will respond to environmental stimuli. And that could be touch, it could be sound, it could be some chemical, smell, okay? Reproduction. So all living things are capable of reproduction. Now on the left here in that image, I'm showing you an example of asexual reproduction, which is also known as binary fission, or literally just mitosis. So you have one cell, right? It grows to a certain size, and then that cell will split into two. There's a bunch of stuff that happens in that process, and we're going to actually talk about mitosis in a couple of chapters. But essentially, you go from one cell, one parent cell, to two identical daughter cells. Okay, that's pretty much asexual reproduction in a nutshell. Many organisms use this mode of reproduction. For example, bacteria reproduce asexually. There are some fungi that reproduce asexually. There are even some plants and animals that will reproduce asexually as well. Many organisms reproduce sexually. So here on my right, I've got two flies, and they're in the act of sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is preceded by a process called meiosis, which we'll talk about. That's how gametes are formed, so egg and sperm cells. And those cells then come together during fertilization. The benefit of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction is that offspring, they're not identical to either of the parents involved. And so what sexual reproduction gives us is an increase in genetic diversity or variation, which is extremely important in an evolutionary sense. Okay, and we're going to talk about evolution in just a second. So all living things show organization. All living things respond to stimuli. All living things reproduce. All living things grow and develop, even single-celled organisms, all the way up to multicellular complex organisms like us. And that growth and development is definitely under genetic control. But there's a mental impact that can be at play. So just to give you an example, I like to use humans because it seems like we can relate to that the best. On the left here, I'm showing you a sperm cell here and an egg cell here. So genetic information from dad was housed inside of this nucleus, and genetic information from mom was housed inside this nucleus. There was a fusion of these two, and now all the genetic information is housed in the nucleus of this cell. This first cell right here would be called the zygote. Okay? Now that zygote is going to grow. And so when we talk about growth here, this is called cleavage. This single cell that you started off with, it started to divide by mitosis, and you eventually became a ball of cells. And then that ball of cells, certain genes were turned on and turned off, and certain cells developed into different types of tissue. So some of those cells became epithelial tissue, which forms your skin. And some of those cells became nervous tissue, which forms your brain and your spinal cord. Some of those cells turned into muscle tissue. Some of those cells turn into cardiac tissue, which forms your heart and eventually your arteries and your veins. Okay, that's called differentiation. So there's growth, and then there's development. Okay, and all of that definitely is under genetic control. Here's another example, right? This cat just had some kittens. Those kittens, again, started off as a single cell that grew and developed. Eventually you have kittens up throughout their lifetime, right, to become adult cats. Okay, regulation. So all processes that are occurring inside of a living organism are under control. They're regulated. And that regulation is going to occur at all different levels. It might be at the molecular level, or it might be higher than that at the organismal level. So I'll give you some examples. We'll talk about chemical reactions that take place. We're going to talk more about those on the next slide, or the next couple slides. So chemical regulation, every chemical process that's happening inside your body right now or inside of any living organism is going to be regulated by enzymes. So enzymes really control the speed as well as whether or not a chemical reaction actually takes place. So all of that is regulated. Transport. In a couple of chapters we're going to talk about how stuff has to move into your cells or out of your cells, right? You need nutrient molecules to come into your cells. You need waste products to go out of your cells. That's called transport, okay, across the membrane. Transport across the membrane is regulated. There are proteins that are going to regulate the flow of molecules across that membrane. Blood flow is a great example of regulation. Through hormones, your body is able to regulate the size of your blood vessels. Okay, they can be told to increase or dilate or to decrease their width. Okay, there's also smooth muscles that line all of your blood vessels, and those can contract or expand to also change the rate of blood flow. In your veins, you also have one-way blood flow valves, which prevents the backflow of blood flow. And so all of that relates to regulation. Okay, blood flow throughout your body is definitely regulated. Homeostasis. This kind of goes hand in hand with regulation. Your cells in your body have to maintain a constant internal environment, even if the environment outside of your cells is drastically changing. That's called homeostasis. If your cells are not able to maintain homeostasis, they may perish, they may die. Here's a great example. The polar bear in this picture, he has to be able to thermoregulate. So temperatures may change, but he has to be able to maintain a constant internal temperature. How does he do that? Well, one of the ways is it's an adaptation. He has a nice thick layer of fat as well as nice thick fur. and his skin also secretes oils that will help to repel water. Okay, so he can stay pretty dry, and he could also maintain a warm, kind of constant internal body temperature. Again, that's called thermal regulation, and there's a bunch of adaptations that this organism has evolved to help him to survive in the climate in which he lives in. Okay, energy processing or metabolism. So every organism, every living thing needs energy to survive, and how we get that energy depends on what type of organism we are. So plants or photosynthetic organisms, they're going to complete the process of photosynthesis. This is an essential process to all living things on the planet. So organisms like us, we depend on plants. Plants are going to be able to take energy from the sun, so sunlight, wave energy, in the presence of water and carbon dioxide, and they're going to be able to convert that energy, the sun's energy, into glucose, okay, food, as well as oxygen. The important product here is the glucose, the food. Glucose is going to be a form of stored potential energy. Okay, where did that energy come from? The sun. So the plants were able to take sunlight and convert that energy into chemical energy, the energy stored in food. That process is essential to all life on our planet. Also notice the other product, oxygen here. That's also essential to organisms like us. Why? So we use oxygen in a process called cellular respiration. This is our second form of metabolism here. And in cellular respiration, we're going to take food, glucose, that stored energy that was produced by the plants, and in the presence of oxygen, which also comes from plants, we are going to have some products here that are byproducts. So we have carbon dioxide will be produced and water will be produced, but really importantly is this final product here of energy. So we are able to take the chemical energy stored in the bonds of glucose and convert that to an energy source which our cells can use. And I'll just let you know from now, we're going to be doing both of these processes, really studying both of them in detail. The energy produced during cellular respiration is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And we're going to talk a lot more about that molecule in some future chapters. Okay, so energy processing or metabolism, the two main types that we're going to discuss this semester are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Both are essential. I'm not sure if I mentioned this. Just want to make sure that I mention it. The sun is the ultimate source of energy for our planet. So that sunlight that comes down every day is really important to life. Without it, plants wouldn't be able to make food, and then we wouldn't have a source of energy. Okay? So the sun is the ultimate source of energy. Okay, so this next shared property of all living things is evolution. So what evolution is it's the process of gradual change in which species change over time, and new species can arise from older species or from previously existing species. The father of evolution, the scientist who's given credit with coming up with the mechanism by which evolution occurs, is Charles Darwin. He published his findings in a scientific journal, and he came up with, again, the mechanism behind which evolution occurs, which is called natural selection. You probably have heard of survival of the fittest. That's a little bit misleading. Sometimes students will hear that and think that, natural selection means the survival of the biggest, toughest organisms, and that's not always true. What natural selection is it's actually the reproductive success of an organism. That's the measurement. So organisms that survive and reproduce get their genetic information into the next generation. That's fitness. Okay, so when we talk about fitness, we're talking about reproductive success. So in this picture down here, this series of pictures, I kind of give you an example of how evolution could play out. So in that first picture, I want you to imagine that this beetle population is living in a forest. Okay, and there's lots of different colors in the forest, right? You've got the green leaves of the trees and shrubbery close to the ground. You've got the, brown tree trunks. You've got the dark dirt at the forest floor. You've got lots of different colors. And so in this original beetle population, again, all the way on the left, number 1, you can see that there's a lot of variation in beetle color within that population. Okay, you have beetles that are very, very lightly colored. You have beetles that are kind of in the middle, and you've got beetles that are very, very dark. That's key for evolution. What evolution is going to act upon is variation within the population. So you have to have variation in order to have evolutionary success. That's kind of the key ingredient. So now this beautifully colored forest, I want you to picture, gets burned to the ground. Okay, so there is no longer the green leaves and the brown tree trunks and the different colors in that forest. Instead, what you're left with is a kind of a background of just black soot. Now the beetles survive that forest fire, okay, and there's still variation in the population, right? There's light colored beetles and medium colored beetles and really dark colored beetles. And so now, since you've got this black background, there's going to be certain beetles that have an evolutionary advantage. Okay, they're better adapted, we would say, to that new environment. Originally, all of the beetles had really the same fitness. Okay, if you're looking at just color, they would be preyed upon or eaten kind of equally. But now that you have this dark black background, now being dark colored, being a dark colored beetle, is going to be an advantage, or we would say an evolutionary adaptation. Those beetles who are darker in color have a higher likelihood of being camouflaged or blending into that dark sooty background. And those beetles that are lighter are going to stick out, and so they're going to be preyed upon. So we've got the bird in figure number 2 eating all the light colored beetles. Okay, and so if you look at number 3, look at the change in the beetle population. Compare figure 1 with figure 3. Okay, in figure 3, you can see that there's no longer any really light colored beetles. They've all been eaten. And so those beetles that survive, do not get eaten by the bird, those are going to be the beetles that reproduce. And so they're going to put their genetics for darker color into the next generation. So if we look at figure number 4, what we see is there's definitely an increase in the frequency of those traits that have conferred that enhanced survival. So those darker colored beetles, there's definitely going to be more of them. That's called macroevolution. If you take General Biology 2 with me, we'll actually get into this in more detail. Okay, so yes, all living things are going to experience evolution. They're going to experience pressures, and there's going to be a change in populations over time. Those who are best suited for the environment will survive and reproduce. Okay, that natural selection is, again, based on reproductive success. Okay, here's some more examples of adaptations. So again, this is a key characteristic of living organisms. And so the beetles in our last example, being a darkly colored beetle after the forest burned down, was an adaptation. Here's some more. So in the picture on the left, you can see that's a pygmy seahorse. He has genetic characteristics that enhance his survival in that particular environment. So he's living in a coral reef, and you can see that his coloration really allows him to blend into that background, which helps him to evade predators, but also helps him to capture prey. He can kind of hide out in there until something passes by, and he can just kind of sneak up on it. So it's definitely an evolutionary adaptation to be colored that way. On the right, you can see those are 2 zebras. This is kind of an interesting adaptation. So you can see those 2 zebras are at their watering hole, and they're drinking some water, and there's probably predators in the area. And so it's very interesting. Zebras will orient themselves, so 2 zebras will orient themselves kind of hind to hind. And as they're doing that, it's believed, okay, so scientists have done these studies and gathered data, it's believed that by standing that way, the predators in the area, so lioness, they cannot distinguish one organism from the other. So it doesn't look like two zebras, I guess. It appears to be one large zebra, maybe too big for that lioness to take down. So we believe that, again, that's an evolutionary adaptation. It's a behavioral adaptation. They are actually kind of born with that behavior to stand in that particular way to try to evade predators. Okay, so here's your next Are You With Me? So you want to pause the video here, get out your in-class assessment sheet, and you're going to go through those 9 shared described characteristics that we just went through that are shared by all living things. You want to define each and give me some examples of each that I did not give you. So that might take a little bit of research on your end. When you're finished, you want to come back. I've got a couple questions for you. Okay, so the first question. All life displays order. Which of the following cells have genetic material but do not have it enclosed in a nucleus? Animal cells, plant cells, bacterial cells, or eukaryotic cells? The answer here would be bacterial cells. So remember, bacterial cells are going to be prokaryotic, which means before the nucleus. Okay, next question. Which of these individuals is likely to be most successful in an evolutionary sense? Or again, we could use the term fittest. So which one of these is the fittest in an evolutionary sense? A reproductively sterile individual who never gets sick. That term sterile means that they cannot bear offspring. Okay, so a reproductively sterile individual who never gets sick. Or an organism that dies after 5 days of life but leaves 20 offspring, all of whom survive to reproduce. Or a male who mates with 100 females and fathers 1 offspring. Or an organism that lives 100 years and leaves 1 offspring whom survives to reproduce. I'll give you a minute to think about that. And hopefully you answered the blue. So an organism that dies after 5 days of life but leaves 20 offspring. Remember, fitness in an evolutionary sense is all about reproduction. So the organism that leaves the most offspring, and then those offspring also reproduce, that's going to be the fittest, right? If you chose the yellow, an organism that lives 100 years but only leaves 1 offspring, you've got to look at the numbers there, 20 compared to 1. So the organism that died in 5 days but left 20 offspring is definitely the fittest in an evolutionary sense. Okay, so the next thing that I'd like to talk about are the levels of biological organization. Okay, and so we're going to be going through each one of these levels, but just to give you the list here, atoms come together to form molecules. Molecules come together to form macromolecules. Those form organelles, which make up cells. Groups of cells compose tissues. Groups of tissues will make organs. Organs form organ systems. All of the organ systems in an organism make the organism. And then the next level is population, then community, ecosystem, and biosphere. So again, we're going to talk about each of those. The figure here on the right shows us each of those levels. And I'm going to give you some more examples of each of them as well. So before we get into those levels, I want to introduce you to 2 terms, reductionism and emergent properties. So if you think about the levels that scientists might study on, so for example, let's say a scientist wants to know more about the immune system in a particular species. Right? They're not going to study the whole organism because that's pretty difficult. And so instead they're going to break that organism down into its parts and pieces. They're going to study just the immune system. And in fact, that might be too big. They might study just one particular cell type of that immune system. So for example, they may study B cells. Okay, so that idea of taking a really complex system and breaking it down and studying the parts and pieces in isolation, that's called reductionism. Now sometimes when scientists find something at the cellular level, they have to put those parts and pieces back together and study it now at the organismal level. And sometimes when they do that, there will be what are called emergent properties. So these are properties, characteristics, that weren't present when they were studying the parts and pieces of that system. But when they put that system together, these are new properties that emerged when they studied the system as a whole. Here's a simpler example. Let's take water. So water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, water is H2O, so 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. If I were to take water and break it down into its parts and pieces, so break it down into its atoms, right? I've got hydrogen and I've got water. And if I were to study those 2 atoms kind of individually, what I would find is both hydrogen and oxygen are gases. Okay? So if I reduce my system, I find that I have gases. When I put those parts and pieces back together, so the hydrogen and oxygen, H2O, now I have a liquid, right? Water is a liquid. Water can exist in other phases as well, a solid. But again, there's this change, this new property that emerges when I put the parts and pieces back together. So scientists always have to be aware of that. What you see in a petri dish or what you see in a test tube may not be what you're going to see in the whole organism. Okay, so let's look at each level. So we're going to start with atoms. So atoms are going to be the smallest unit of a chemical element that has all of the properties of that element. And we're going to talk more about atoms in the next chapter, in chapter 2. Here's some example. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sodium, chlorine. Those are all examples of individual atoms. And so when we start to put atoms together in very specific ratios, we will form molecules. Molecules are going to be chemical structures made of 2 or more atoms. So water, H2O, that's an example of a molecule. Glucose, right, the product of photosynthesis. Glucose is C6H12O6. It's made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are all examples of molecules. When we have large molecules made up of many atoms, those are called macromolecules. We will be going over the 4 types of biological macromolecules in a couple chapters, and you'll be doing a whole lab on those. Those include carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. In these pictures, so on the left here, this is a macromolecule. This is DNA. It's composed of many atoms, okay, bonded together. And on the right here, this is a molecule of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll we're going to study in a little bit more detail in a later chapter. Chlorophyll is a pigment molecule that is found in plant cells that is responsible for absorbing light from the sun. So this molecule is extremely important to photosynthesis. You can see each one of these individual structures. This is a space-filling model. Each one of these represents a separate atom. And you can see the colors here represent the type of atom. Usually white is hydrogen, black is carbon, red is oxygen. Okay, so we got atoms, molecules, macromolecules. Macromolecules will form organelles, or tiny organs. These are the functional components found inside of our cells. We're going to go over all of the different organelles when we get to chapter 4. This is just one example of one. This is a chloroplast. Chloroplasts have chlorophyll. These are going to be found in some plant cells. So for example, leaves that are green, there's going to be loads of chloroplasts found in there. Some examples of other organelles. The nucleus is an organelle. Its function is to house genetic information. Mitochondria is the site of most of cellular respiration. Okay, so organelles are made out of atoms, molecules, and macromolecules. When you put all of the organelles together into a functional unit, you create a cell. Okay? And again, we know that organisms could be composed of single-celled or multiple cells. In the example that I have here for you, this is one leaf cell. Okay? And it's found inside of a leaf tissue. That leaf cell, you can see, is composed of all these little green circles. Those are all chloroplasts. So it's filled with all of those organelles. And the cell will be surrounded in white here by a plasma membrane. Okay, and this is a plant cell, so it also will have a cell wall. So cells are made of organelles, and our next level up is tissues. Tissues are made of cells. So a tissue is going to be a group of cells that are going to work together to perform a specific function. And in this picture here, I actually have two different tissues. On the right here, so all this material from here to here, this shows the epidermis of a leaf. And so there's a lot of cells here, and their main function is to cover and protect that leaf. On the left-hand side here, these are leaf mesophyll cells. And these cells in here, they're going to be underneath the epidermis, and their job is photosynthesis. Okay? So cells make up tissues, and tissues make up organs, and organs make up organ systems. So an organ is going to be a body part, or if it's an organ system, it's a body system that's going to carry out a particular function. And organs will be made up of tissues. Okay, here's an example of a plant organ. So plants, their organ systems are pretty simple. They have a root system, and they have a shoot system, and the shoot system is composed of stems and leaves, and then reproductive structures. In this particular example, this is a leaf. This is a maple leaf. It's an organ, and its main job is going to be photosynthesis. It's made up of different types of tissues. So, for example, it's made up of epidermal tissue, mesophyll tissue, and even vascular tissue. Okay. Now, if you take into account all of the organ systems in an individual, then you have an organism. Okay, and those organ systems are going to work together to keep that organism at homeostatic levels, to keep it alive. An example of an organism is the maple tree pictured here. It's made up of stems, roots, leaves, and reproductive structures. Those would be the organ systems of the organism. If you take into account all of the individuals of a particular species living in a given area at the same time, that's going to give you a population. Okay, so in this example here, this is all of the maple trees living in this particular forest make up a population of maple trees. When you throw in there all of the other living things, so all of the maple trees plus, the deer that are shown in this picture, plus all the fern that look like they're growing on the forest floor in this picture, plus all the bacteria and the fungi and the other plant species, all the living things, all of the living species in a particular region collectively together is called a community. That's the next level up. Okay? The next level up from community is going to be ecosystem. So an ecosystem is going to be the community, so all the living stuff in a given area, plus all of the non-living environment. So it's going to include the atmosphere, right, the air, the hydrosphere, the water, the lithosphere, the land. Okay? In this example here, this is a typical forest in North America. It looks like something right out of the Adirondacks. So an ecosystem would include, all of the living and non-living stuff there in that water, and all of the non-living and living stuff on land as well. Some other examples of ecosystems besides forest would be a grassland or desert, coral reef. Those are all examples of typical ecosystems. When you consider collectively all of the ecosystems on the planet, then we have the biosphere. It includes all the living as well as non-living stuff on the planet. Okay, here's another example. Again, going through each level and giving you kind of an example at each level. So I'll let you guys look at that. And then you can pause the video. Here is an Are You With Me? You're going to describe those levels that we just talked about. Try to give me an example at each level, an example that I didn't give you. And then I want you to also describe these two very important terms, reductionism and emergent properties. And when you're finished, you can unpause it, and I'll have some questions for you. Okay, so here's the first question. Which of the following statements is false? Tissues exist within organs, which exist within organ systems. In blue, communities exist within populations, which exist within ecosystems. Green, organelles exist within cells, and cells make up tissues. Communities exist within ecosystems, which exist in the biosphere. So which one is not going in more complex order? Hopefully you answered blue. So we'd have to flip-flop communities and populations to make that one right. Okay, next question. Which of the following sequences represents the hierarchy of biological organization from the most inclusive to the most restricted level? So going from kind of the broadest to the most restrictive. So organelle, tissue, biosphere, ecosystem, population. Organ, organism, tissue, organelle, molecule. Organism, community, biosphere, molecule, tissue, organ. Or in yellow, biosphere, ecosystem, community, population, organism. So it would be yellow, right? Biosphere is most inclusive and includes everything on the planet. You go down to ecosystem, this is just one type of ecosystem. Community would be just the living stuff. Population would be just one species. An organism would be one individual. So we went from most inclusive to most restrictive, or broadest to most specific. Okay, here's another question. The smallest unit of biological structure that meets the functional requirements of living is the... So which of these is considered to be living? It's the smallest unit. Organ, organelle, cell, or macromolecule? That would be cell, right? So living organisms can be single or multi-celled, but the organelles or the macromolecules that a cell is composed of are not considered to be living. A cell is the smallest unit that has all of the characteristics of a living thing. A group of individuals of the same species living in the same area is called a family, community, population, or ecosystem. So you got one species. That would be population. Okay, so we're on the last part here. We're going to talk about the diversity of life. So to start off, we have identified over 8.7 million different species of organisms on the planet. These organisms have evolved through time, and scientists responsible for figuring out that pattern of relatedness are called evolutionary biologists. And scientists in general, we like to categorize and classify organisms, and so there's an entire branch of biology devoted to that. It's called taxonomy. So taxonomy is the science of classifying and naming living organisms, both extinct as well as extant or still living today on the planet. So that's a lot of work, categorizing and naming 8.7 million different organisms. And so what scientists have done, evolutionary biologists with the help of taxonomists, they have created phylogenetic trees, phylogenies. And here's an example of a phylogenetic tree that has been built to show how all life on the planet is related. And these can be done to be more specific too. So, I mean, there's phylogenetic trees that are just for human evolution, for example. This one is very, very broad. This is called the tree of life. So again, this takes into account kind of everybody on the planet who exists now or who has existed in the past. At the base of any of these phylogenetic trees, what you're going to find is this open kind of bottom. And what that shows you is that there is a common ancestor to all life on the planet, but we're not 100% sure what that first organism looked like. Okay, we do have some ideas, but we're not 100% certain of how life started. So what we do know, though, is after life started, there has been evolution throughout those 3.8 billion years. And so we've evolved into three basic categories, which we are going to call domains. And you're going to hear more about this in lab. Or read about more about this in lab. So those three domains are listed here. The domains bacteria, archaea, and the eukarya. So those are the 3 domains that exist on the planet today. The bacteria and the archaea, just to give you a little bit more information, those are composed of prokaryotic organisms. So all of the bacteria and archaea are prokaryotic, and they are single-celled, so they're unicellular. The archaea are really a neat group. We consider these organisms to be the extremophiles. So the archaea are going to be organisms that are found in environments on the planet that really didn't think life could exist at. So for example, the halophiles here, these are organisms that live in extreme salty conditions. All of these methanoorganisms, Methanococcus bacterium, these are all organisms that like high levels of methane. The thermos, these guys like extreme heat, okay? There's organisms that prefer highly acidic or highly basic environments. So we call them the extremophiles. They like extreme environments. All of the other kind of regular bacteria fit over here in the domain bacteria. So, you know, we've got cyanobacteria, which we saw in that one of those first slides there. The spirochetes, you guys have heard of Lyme disease. The organism that causes Lyme disease fits into this category of spirochetes. We've got gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. All of those bacteria fit here into this category. Some common bacteria that you've heard of streptococcus, right? You've all had strep throat at one point in your life. That's caused by just a regular bacteria called streptococcus. Staphylococcus, if you've ever had a staph infection, caused by that. Okay, so the archaea and the bacteria are all single-celled organisms that are prokaryotic. If they live in an extreme environment, we put them in the domain archaea. If they don't live in an extreme environment, they're put into the domain bacteria. The eukarya, which is where we fit, so the eukarya, these are going to be organisms that have eukaryotic cells. They have membrane-bound nuclei. And there's a variety here. If we look at the entamoeba, the slime molds, the ciliates, the flagellates, a lot of these guys, they fit into the kingdom Protista. They're all protists. And then we have plants, fungi, and animals. Okay, those are our major groups there. So we split all life on the planet into 3 really broad categories, which we call domains. And then we can, from there, we can break them up farther. So at the very top there, the broadest taxon is the domain level. As we go down this list of taxons, we get more and more specific or restricted or less inclusive. So you're going to hear about this in lab too. This is how taxonomists classify living organisms. They start at the broadest level. They figure out, all right, is this organism a prokaryote or a eukaryote? Am I putting this organism into the domain bacteria, archaea, or eukaryote? Let's say it's a eukaryotic organism. You go down to the next level down, it's called the kingdom, and you've got to ask yourself, is this organism a plant, an animal, a fungus, or a protist? And then from there, you put that organism into a phylum, and then a class, an order, a family, a genus, and a species. Okay? As we move down again, we get more restricted. So those organisms that belong to the same species, they are very similar. Okay? In fact, the definition of species is organisms that belong to the same species have many similarities, morphologically, anatomical structures, and most importantly, they can reproduce in nature. And that reproduction should lead to a fertile, viable offspring. So offspring that live and then can reproduce themselves. Now every organism on the planet, ends up with a scientific name, which is going to be composed of the genus and species that the organism belongs to. So for example, for us, humans, we belong to the genus Homo and the species Sapien. So our scientific name is Homo sapien. Our common name is humans. Okay. So on this next slide, I wanted to just show you how we go down from domain to species level and how the domain level is the broadest and the species level is the most specific. So let's look up at the very top, domain. you can see within there, this is the domain Eukarya, there are animals, plants, protists, and fungi. All belong to that same domain. It's very, very broad. If you go down a level to the kingdom Animalia, animals, you will find now that there are not any plants, fungi, or protists in that picture. So we just got more specific or more restricted. If you go down to the phylum Chordata, this includes all the chordates, you'll notice that any organism that does not have a vertebral column will not be pictured there. Okay, so you can see that the starfish is gone, the jellyfish is gone, the spider, the beetle, those are all gone because those do not have a spinal column. Okay, and if you go down to the class Mammalia below that, you can see that only pictured there are mammals. So what's lacking is the turtle, the shark, the fish, the frog. All of those are lacking from that. If you go down to the next level, which is order, so domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, those are the order is primates. Okay, so only primates are pictured there. We got rid of the platypus and the kangaroo. Down one level, we go to family. And so pictured there, we disclude the human and the lemur. We go down to the genus Pan, and you can see that those include only those chimpanzees there. And if you go down to the species level, you can see that it's only that particular species of chimp that is found there. So you can see how we went from very, very broad at the top at the domain level to very, very specific or restricted down at the species level. So again, taxonomists will use these taxon to classify organisms. And then every organism ends up with a specific scientific genus and species name. So to end off here, I just wanted to let you know that there are multiple branches of biological study. So here's a short list, and you had to define these on your vocab sheet. Molecular biology, biochemistry, microbiology, neurobiology, paleontology, zoology, botany. These are all different fields. Pictured on the right, those look like paleontologists. Those are going to be studying archaeological remains, probably looking, in this particular picture, they look like they're at a dinosaur, at a dig site where they're pulling up dinosaur bones, dinosaur fossils. So that's what paleontologists would specifically do. Who else is on this list? So the other guy sitting here in the picture of the left is probably a molecular biologist or maybe a biochemist. He's going to be working in a lab. That instrument that he's holding in his hand is called a micropipette. And the tube that looks like he's putting stuff into is a micro tube or a centrifuge tube. So he's dealing with small amounts of maybe DNA or RNA or maybe virus or bacteria. So he's looking at stuff, at the molecular level. He also might be a biochemist. He might be mixing chemicals there in that tube. Might be a microbiologist dealing with microorganisms. Okay, so if he is doing research on viruses or bacteria, he might be a microbiologist. Neurobiology would be studying of the nervous system, of brain and spinal cord. Botany there will be the study of plants. In fact, we're going to spend the tail end of this semester studying plants. Okay, so here's your last list of Are You With Me's. So again, you want to pause this and go ahead and answer some of these questions. And then go ahead and press play again. I've just got 2 more questions for you. So the first question, the most restrictive taxon is, so the most restrictive or least inclusive, is it the domain level, the species level, the phylum level, or the genus level? So the most restrictive would be the species level. That second question, where in a phylogenetic tree would you expect to find the organism that had evolved most recently? Would it be at the base, within the branches, at the nodes, or at the branch tips? And that would be at the branch tips. Okay, so the organisms that have evolved most recently will be at the farthest tips on that phylogenetic tree. Okay, that's it for chapter 1.